What's up, guys? So I know I said that wouldn't be posting until Tuesday, but then we had some news drop today about Deshaun Watson being suspended for 6 games, and I'll get to my ideas on that in a minute. I can tell you, it doesn't make me happy. I was expecting at least an 8 game, if not a full season, but it is what it is. I still have them coming in last in this division, but we'll get there in a minute. So today we're going to be breaking down the AFC North. Got the Bengals, the Ravens, the Steelers, and the Browns in that division. Pretty good division. I'll say it first, whenever I looked at this, I wasn't necessarily excited to make the video, but then after I started doing some deep dives, I think I found some pretty good stuff, some pretty interesting stuff to back up what I'm going to say here. And so to start out, we'll talk about the Bengals. And, there's been a lot of talk about Super Bowl fatigue and, how sometimes these teams that make it to the play or make it to the Super Bowl, turn around the next season and they're not very impressive. I think that, if you're going to have that idea of that Super Bowl fatigue, then I have to ask the question, is that going to show in the regular season, or is it going to show in the playoffs? Because I've got them winning 11 and a half games in the regular season and making the playoffs, and I could see them taking an early exit in the playoffs, but I think they're still going to win this division. And I'll get to a few reasons why. So week 1, they play the Steelers, and whenever I first looked at this matchup, I thought this is a 50-50 game. It could go either way. But then the more I started to look at some different things, the more I started to give this to the Bengals, because there's a few different sources out there that have said how the Bengals is one of the most upgraded offensive lines going into this season. There's a source that has them ranked as the 8th overall offensive line going into this season. And then it has the Steelers' defensive line ranked as 4th. And so that sounds pretty interesting. 8th offensive line going up against the 4th defensive line to start the season, week 1. And, I started thinking, well, Mitch Trubisky's probably going to be the starting quarterback week 1. And I could see this becoming a shootout to some extent. Nothing crazy high scoring, but close game. I think it's going to come down to the wire, and in the fourth quarter we're going to see some high volume passing. And whenever it comes down to that, I just don't see how week 1 being led by Mitch Trubisky, while I do love Mitchell Trubisky, I don't see how they could keep up with the Bengals and coming in and, really getting that offense going and picking things up in the fourth quarter. And so for that reason, I started to give the full game to the Bengals and to win that week 1. Now, another thing that I love about the Bengals is Joe Mixon. So last year he had 292 attempts. He was out 1 or 2 games, but he basically played the whole season. And with the upgrade at that offensive line, where he saw last year 4.1 yards per carry, that was, his average. I think that'll go up this year with the better offensive line. It'll be about 4.9, closer to 5, maybe even in the 5s, right? Now, other than that on the Bengals, 11 and a half wins after the Super Bowl appearance. That's a decent season. That's a pretty good season, especially with the now extended season of the NFL. And, that week 1 matchup against the Steelers, whenever at first I thought, it'll be a 50-50 game, I don't think so anymore. I think that, the Steelers having Mitch Trubisky, and what I like about Mitch this year is that he was able to go under Josh Allen last year and he was able to learn, just kind of sit back for a year, probably matured a lot. And that's why at first I was hesitant on that game and who was going to win. But then, just getting down to the nitty-gritty, I think fourth quarter, who's Mitch Trubisky against Joe Burrow? He's a nobody against Joe Burrow, especially with the weapons that Joe Burrow has. And we'll talk more about the weapons that the Steelers have in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the number 2 team that I have in this division, and that's the Ravens. Now, the Ravens were probably one of the toughest to stat out fantasy-wise. And all I can say is, stick with Lamar, stick with Mark Andrews. Now, we all know Lamar. He's probably going to miss 1 or 2 games or leave at halftime because he's having tummy issues because that dude's got some, I guess, pretty bad bowel movements from what we've seen in the past. Yeah, and we all know it. He's tried to deny it, but, he's left some games to take some doo-doos, right? And so I've got the Ravens winning 11 games this year. Compare that to the Bengals at 11.5. So Ravens coming in second. And now let's go a little bit of a deep dive into fantasy real quick. The running back position in Baltimore, to me it's scary. I don't like it. I'm not drafting any of those guys in any leagues whatsoever. J.K. Dobbins or Gus Edwards. And now I know some people are pretty high on them, especially if they stay healthy. But I pulled out some stats that I want to look at. And let's say this. Let's just say J.K. Dobbins is healthy. Let's forget about Gus Edwards real quick. Let's say J.K. Dobbins is healthy. So, the one season that he was completely healthy was in 2020. And in this season, he had 2 games that were over 100 yards. And his best game was their very first opening week 1. And that game, I think that game was against the Bengals. And so in that game, he went 13 for 160 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's pretty nice. That's a lovely game to have on your roster in fantasy. But after that, after week 1, for the rest of the season, and he played every game, he had snaps every game, he only had 1 more 100-yard game, and that's including receiving. So his total yards were never up in the hundreds again, except for 1 game. Now, and this was in a loss against Pittsburgh, and he had 15 attempts for 113 yards and 0 touchdowns in that game. So he had 113 yards and no touchdowns. And 2 games before that, both of the games before this one, he had 0 touchdowns. So we're going to start to disprove his touchdown dependency, his touchdown equity, because he's not going to be that guy, especially in the Ravens offense. He's not going to bring in all these touchdowns, even if the yards aren't there. This guy, we're going to rely more on yardage, and he's not going to be putting up crazy numbers because Lamar is the lead running back in that offense. So he had 2 games for over 100 yards that season, his only season where he's been healthy. And then the 2 games before his second 100-yard game, he had 0 touchdowns. And then the following 5 games, up until the season closer, the last week of the season, which was versus the Browns, he had 0 touchdowns. And, anywhere from 15 to 60 yards and 0 touchdowns in the next 5 games after that. Now, in the season closer versus the Browns, he had 2 touchdowns, but he had 7 attempts for 22 yards. So the touchdown boost right there makes it look a little better. But overall, if this guy is healthy for a full season, he's not one of those touchdown-dependent players who actually gets touchdowns. He's not going to be picking up the yardage that we would want our running backs to see in fantasy football. And the attempts might be there, but they also might not be there. I think it's going to vary week to week in what this offense brings. I think be safe, be smart. If you're drafting, draft Lamar Jackson and if you're drafting, draft Mark Andrews. Those are the only two dudes from the Ravens, fantasy-wise, that I would even give a thought about. Now, Mark Andrews, I love him, so I'll be trying to get him as much as I can. Lamar, where he's going, I'm not really big on taking a quarterback, but if he falls to me, sometimes I might take him. So back to the running backs in Baltimore. We just went over J.K. Dobbins and why to stay away from him, and I've just got one thing to say about Gus Edwards if he's healthy. For his career, he's had 414 attempts, and he's had 2,152 yards. We know of dudes who have put that up in a season. Now, I mean, that's crazy numbers for one season, but 2,152 yards for his career, and 10 touchdowns. I mean, come on. I'm staying away from the Ravens' backfield. If it's not Lamar, if it's not Mark Andrews, I don't want any of those guys at the Ravens. And I honestly don't think that their running backs can stay healthy. I think it's going to be probably Mike Davis taking the bulk of that work. And we saw what he did with the Falcons last year. Not a lot. Now, granted that the Ravens are more equipped to run the ball, I still don't think that any of those backs in that field are going to be worth anything. Don't draft them. So now, let's move on and let's talk about the Steelers. One thing that always makes the Steelers interesting is the head coach. Love their head coach. Great guy. Mike, he really knows how to run that team. He knows how to get players to play to the best of their ability, and I admire that in him. So let's look real quick at what the Steelers, they need to do. One, I already said Mitch Trubisky. He's going to be the starter week 1. I believe that because I believe that, their head coach is a smart man. But I think that this needs to be a learning year under a different quarterback for Kenny Pickett. I think he needs to sit back. He needs to watch Mitch Trubisky, not do things right, but also make mistakes because you learn better from mistakes whenever you see mistakes. And Mitch is probably going to be making a few mistakes every game. But whenever I went and looked at, the depth chart, I saw Kenny Pickett was 3rd on the depth chart for quarterbacks. He's still behind Mason Rudolph, so it seems like they know what they're doing and they're going to be pretty smart about it. And I've heard a few guys say this. Kenny Pickett's one of those guys who's got an obvious ceiling. So it's better for him to go in as a rookie and to start every game. Kind of like how we saw Mac Jones do last year where, Bill Belichick said, sorry, Cam, we're cutting you. Mac Jones is going to be our guy. He's going to be our starter. And while I like that move for the Patriots, I don't think that would be smart here for Kenny Pickett. Let's not go against the grain. And let's not do things just because it's been done once, right? I think that overall it's better for a quarterback to sit back and to learn for a year or two and then to come in and be the starter. I think that's whenever you'll see them really reach their full potential. And while Mitch Trubisky, he was able to sit out last year and, sit behind Josh Allen, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, probably the best quarterback in the league just from an overall standpoint. And he was able to learn a lot from that offense. He was able to learn a lot from that quarterback. So I think that will help him going into the season. That's why I've got the Steelers winning 9 games. And, a few other things to hit on for the Steelers. I already said it needs to be a learning year for Pickett. But Najee. So last year he only had 10 touchdowns, 7 on the ground, and 3 receiving. I think that probably stays the same. I like Najee a lot. I drafted him a lot in different places last year. Do I think he'll put up the numbers that he did last year this year? Not necessarily. But if anything, I think that his touchdowns go up. I think he becomes one of those more touchdown-dependent guys rather than that dude who is just going to get those short passes thrown to him and get a point for every reception. I think he's going to be one of those touchdown-dependent guys, and he's going to lean more on those touchdowns to get him through and, to help him actually put up points this year. So then I want to talk about Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, and Pat Freiermuth. Now, I think this is going to vary week to week because Mike Tomlin, like I said, he's a smart coach. I think it's going to change week to week based on the game plan. And I think that, 1 week we're going to probably see Pat Freiermuth have 2 touchdowns. The next week it might be Chase Claypool who has 2 touchdowns. The next week it might be Najee who has 2 touchdowns. But Deontay, I think this is going to be that guy that you're going to want to target in those PPR leagues because I think he's just going to be their, down and dirty dog, and he's going to get those receptions and he's going to put up those yardage numbers. He's reliable. He's got good hands. We all know that about Deontay. Claypool, he's more of the boom or bust kind of guy. I think he'll definitely bust more weeks than he booms, but I think he'll at least have 4 weeks, 5 weeks where, he's gotten 1 touchdown, 2 touchdowns, and maybe 5 receptions, right? 3 receptions. And then Pat Freiermuth. I wouldn't necessarily put him on the same table as Chase Claypool because I don't think it'll be as boom or bust. I definitely think there's going to be weeks where the game plan is suited more towards him, but I think he's going to be a reliable target for Mitch. Who knows, maybe even if Kenny Pickett does become the starter at some point. I think he's going to be a reliable target for those guys to kind of lean on, whenever the going gets tough. You got to pick up a 5-yard first down. You got to pick up 7 yards. You got to get the ball down the field. I think Pat's going to come in handy there, while also having more boom weeks than Claypool, where he's got 1 touchdown and 7 catches, right? So I like Freiermuth in that point. I think get him with maybe 1 or 2 other tight ends. If it's just your common redraft, I'd say draft him and 1 other tight end. If you're doing stuff like best ball, then, obviously pick up those other 2, and those boom weeks will help you out there from Pat Freiermuth. Last year he had 7 touchdowns. I think we see that at least get to 10 this year. So I'm thinking Pat has probably 10 touchdowns, maybe even 12. Who knows? But basically it comes down to who does Mike Tomlin trust that week. And I trust Mike, so I think he's going to be making the right decisions week to week. And last, what we've all been waiting for, the Browns. So, I wasn't going to drop a podcast today, but then the news dropped that Watson was going to be suspended for 6 games. And so I went in and I changed up the win totals for the Browns. Now, whenever I was expecting Watson to be suspended potentially the full year, and Jacoby Brissett would have been the starter, I had them winning 5.5 games. So I think you'd probably be shocked what that win total is after Watson comes back, because it's not much higher. It goes from 5.5 to 7. And here's why. Watson comes back, and the first week he's back, they play the Ravens. I've got the Ravens coming in second in this division. I know I didn't really talk good about their running backs, but they've got some weapons there. If it's a game that Lamar's not got the runs during, then I think that the Ravens walk away with it, pretty handily. But he comes back. That first week they've got the Ravens. The second week they've got the Bengals. The third week they've got the Dolphins, which is a little bit more winnable. Depends on how we see the Dolphins pan out. Then they've got the Bills. Then they've got the Bucks. And then finally, after all of that, they've got the Texans. So that's Ravens, Bengals, Bills, Bucks. That's 4 games he comes back. I don't think they walk out winners of. But in there you've got the Dolphins and the Texans sprinkled. The Dolphins I'm not as sure of, but the Texans, I think. Which, who knows, it could be that revenge game, right, for the Texans, wanting to get back, wanting to prove a point. But I think that the Browns will win that one, at least that one. And before Watson gets there, I think they'll probably win 1 to 2 games. And then after Watson gets there, week 7, they'll probably win 5. Now, what's interesting about the Browns is, I was talking about O-lines earlier. They've got the number 2 O-line. But what does it mean to run the ball? Because we know their running backs, Kareem Hunt, Nick Chubb, obviously Nick Chubb leading the way. And Nick Chubb's a beast. I love Nick Chubb. He puts his head down and he puts that pedal to the metal and he gets the ball going down the field. But even with a good offensive line, even with 2 good running backs, and Deshaun Watson coming in, I don't see it working out for them. Because, we know their wide receivers, Amari Cooper, David Bell, Donovan Peoples-Jones. Amari Cooper, I loved him at the Cowboys. I'd almost always have him on a fantasy team. But going from one quarterback to another in a season, that's pretty difficult. And starting out with Jacoby Brissett, that's not the best situation to be in. Now, Watson's better, sure, but this team is built more on paper to run the ball. So they've got a tough schedule. Okay, they don't have easy matchups in their schedule. So, a lot of times if they're down by a touchdown, down by 2 touchdowns, down by 10 points, it's the fourth quarter, it's the second half, that offense is built to run the ball. They're not going to have an easy time getting the ball downfield with an offense that's built to run the ball. Now, granted, they could easily scheme up some things, some screenplays to the running backs, screenplays to the wide receivers, switch things up a little bit. I don't know. I don't see it going well for them in the second half if they're down at all. If they're up and they're able to run the ball, run the clock down, then I think that's their best case scenario. But being down late in the football game, I don't think they're going to be able to drive down the field and they're going to be able to make it happen. And another thing is, whenever you ask Watson to do more, does it equal wins? So, because this team is really set up to run the ball more, whenever you need your quarterback to come in and you need him to take you down the field and you need him to win you a ball game late, will he show up? So, whenever Watson's been asked to do more, has he had more wins? So, 2020 was Watson's best season. It was also the Texans' worst record. Watson had a 70.2 completion percentage. He threw for 4,823 yards. He had 33 touchdowns, and he had 7 interceptions. That's a great season. But all of it was to go 4-12. So they were asking Watson to do a lot that season with a little, and he did do a lot. But in the end, it meant nothing because it was still his worst season winning-wise as a starting quarterback. And whenever it comes down to it, I think the Browns are going to be asking him to do too much this season with too little at the wide receiver position. And I don't think that equals more wins for the Browns. Therefore, I think the Browns win 7 games. After the news, they went from 5.5 to 7. I don't see them winning any more than 7 games this season. That's all for today, guys. Thanks for watching.